The morning Frederick Slater rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, he was not looking for love. He was looking for work, a dry place to sleep, and maybe a decent meal that did not taste like trail dust and regret. He came in from the South Road with the sun still low and orange behind him, his bay horse, a steady animal he called Drum, moving at an easy walk along the main street of a town that was still finding its shape. Caldwell was a border town sitting right on the edge of Kansas and Indian Territory, and it had that particular feeling that all border towns had, the sense that it existed between two worlds and belonged fully to neither. There were saloons and a dry goods store and a church that had not yet been painted, and a livery stable that smelled the way livery stables always smell, like animals and old leather and hay that had gotten wet once and never dried right. There was a telegraph office and a small hotel with a porch that sagged on one end. And there was a land office, which was where most men with tired horses and empty pockets eventually ended up. Frederick was 28 years old. He was not a remarkable-looking man in any way that would have stopped a stranger on the street, but there was something steady in his face that people noticed after a moment. A kind of patience that showed in the set of his jaw and in the unhurried way he looked at things. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting and green eyes that caught light in a way that made them look almost gold in certain hours of the afternoon. He had worked cattle drives out of Texas for 6 years, and before that had spent 2 years on a spread in New Mexico, and before that had been a boy in Missouri who grew up fast after his father died and left the family with debts that could not be paid. He was a man who had learned early that the world did not arrange itself for your convenience, and so he arranged himself for the world instead, quietly, without complaint, with the kind of endurance that people who have never had to use it sometimes mistake for indifference. He did not feel indifferent. He had simply learned to carry what needed carrying without letting it show in his face. He tied Drum at the rail in front of the land office and went inside, where a man named Gerald Purcell sat behind a counter that was covered in maps and land surveys and coffee rings. Gerald was a round man in his 50s with a generous mustache and the look of someone who had made peace with being exactly where he was in life. "Looking for work," Frederick said. "I can ride, I can rope, I can manage cattle and green horses both. I know how to read trail and I know how to manage men when that's required. I am not looking for anything fancy." Gerald studied him for a moment with the practiced eye of a man who had seen enough drifters come through that he could generally sort the useful ones from the rest. "You know the Ralston place?" Gerald asked. Frederick said that he did not. "Daniel Ralston runs about 400 head out east of town, maybe 3 miles. Good land, decent water. He is looking for a hand or two to help push his cattle up to the rail yards come early summer. It is honest work, and he pays honest wages. His spread is called the Double R. You cannot miss the gate." Frederick thanked him and went back out into the morning, which had warmed up considerably since he came in from the south. He watered Drum at the trough at the edge of the street, and let the horse stand for a few minutes while he ate a piece of salt pork and hardtack that he had left in his saddlebag from the night before. It was not a fine breakfast, but it was something. He had been in worse situations than this, and he expected he would be in worse situations again, and that steadying thought, which would have depressed a different kind of man, actually gave Frederick a certain calm as he climbed back into the saddle and turned Drum's head east toward the Ralston place. He found the gate without trouble, just as Gerald had said, a simple wooden gate with the letters DR burned into a crossbeam at the top. The property beyond it was open and well kept, with a modest ranch house sitting on a low rise and a barn and corral behind it, and past that, spread out across the flat grassland that ran toward a distant tree line, a good herd of cattle moving slowly in the early morning light. It was the kind of ranch that a man built over years of hard work and careful decision-making. It was not a grand place, but it was solid, and there is something in solidity that can be more beautiful than grandeur. Frederick rode up to the house and called out before he dismounted, which was the courteous thing to do. A man came out of the barn, not the house. He was maybe 60 years old, with a face like a tanned piece of saddle leather and arms that were still thick and strong from decades of physical work. He walked with a slight limp that did not slow him down appreciably, and he looked at Frederick with the direct, assessing gaze that men who work land develop as a matter of necessity. "Daniel Ralston," Frederick asked. "Who wants to know?" Frederick introduced himself and explained that Gerald Purcell had sent him out, and that he was looking for seasonal work. Daniel listened to this without expression, and then asked Frederick a series of direct and practical questions about his experience, about cattle drives and horses, and whether he could work the chutes at the rail yard. Frederick answered all of them plainly and honestly, including the honest answer to the question about wages, which was that he would take what was fair and not argue about it. Daniel seemed to approve of this. He said, "Come on in and have some coffee and we will talk further." It was as Frederick was wiping his boots on the step and preparing to follow Daniel through the front door of the house that the door opened from the inside, and Theresa Ralston stepped out. She was 25 years old, and she was carrying a basket of laundry that she clearly intended to hang on the line that ran along the south side of the house. She had dark hair the color of strong tea, pinned up at the back in the way that women wore their hair in those years, though a few strands had come loose at her temples in the morning heat, and they curled softly against her face. Her eyes were a shade of brown that was so warm and so clear that looking into them was something like looking at firelight through amber glass. She was not a delicate-looking woman. She had the kind of strong, capable look that came from a life that required real work, but she was beautiful in a way that was completely unself-conscious, which is the best kind of beautiful because it does not demand acknowledgement. She looked at Frederick with frank curiosity and no particular flutter. "Morning," she said simply. "Morning," he said back. She went past him to the laundry line, and that was all. Frederick went inside with Daniel and had his coffee and got his job, and all through the conversation he was aware, in a way that was quiet and not at all unpleasant, that something had shifted in the orientation of the world by some small degree, as if a compass needle had found north for the first time. He started work at the Double R the following Monday. The first week, he learned the layout of the land and the habits of the cattle, and the names of the 3 other hands who worked the ranch. A young Mexican man named Rodrigo, who was perhaps 19 and quick and confident in the saddle. An older man named Henry who had come up from the Texas Panhandle, and who never spoke more than was absolutely necessary. And a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Calvin who had a gift with horses that Frederick recognized and respected immediately. He also learned in those first days more about the Ralston family. Daniel was a widower. His wife, Margaret, had died 4 years earlier of a fever that had moved through the territory with merciless efficiency in the summer of 1878. He had a son, James, who was 17, and who helped on the ranch when he was not in the small schoolhouse that had been established in Caldwell the previous year. And he had Theresa, who was his eldest child and who ran the household with a quiet authority that was clearly well established and not resented by anyone. Theresa cooked. She managed the supplies. She kept the accounts in a ledger that she maintained with careful precision, and she helped with the cattle when the work required more hands than Daniel had on payroll. She could ride as well as any of the men on the place, which was better than most, and she roped with a competence that Frederick noticed and privately admired. She was, in every visible sense, the kind of woman who made a difficult life look manageable. She was also, Frederick learned at the end of his first week, engaged to be married. The man's name was Martin Colby. He came to the Double R on a Saturday evening, arriving in a good wagon with a matched pair of gray horses, and wearing clothes that were better than anyone else in Caldwell wore, which was the kind of thing that was noticed and variously interpreted. He was 34 years old, and he owned a mercantile on the main street of town, and also had an interest in a neighboring cattle operation to the north, which meant he was, by the standards of the territory, a man of some means. He was broad-shouldered and well-groomed, and he had the easy confidence of a man who was accustomed to being taken seriously. Frederick was finishing up at the corral when Colby arrived. He watched from a distance as Theresa came out of the house to greet him, and watched Colby take her hand and hold it. There was something about the way Colby held that hand correctly, possessively, as though it were already his property, that made something quiet and careful tighten in Frederick's chest. He told himself it was not his business. He told himself this several times that evening, sitting on his bunk in the small quarters behind the barn, and listening to the prairie wind press against the walls of the building. He told himself he had been on this ranch for exactly 1 week, and he had spoken perhaps 15 sentences to Theresa Ralston, most of which concerned practical matters of ranch work, and he had no basis for whatever it was that had taken up residence in his chest. He told himself all of these things, and he believed all of them, and none of them made that quiet tightening go away. Daniel mentioned it plainly the following Monday, the way that Daniel handled most things directly, without decoration. They were mending a section of fence along the eastern pasture, and Daniel said, without looking up from the wire he was stretching, "You have met Martin Colby, I expect." "Saw him arrive Saturday," Frederick said. "He and my daughter are to be married in October. He is a good man, steady, provides well." Daniel paused. "I want her settled and looked after. She has been holding this family together since her mother passed, and she deserves something easier than she has had." Frederick kept his hands on the wire he was working. "She seems like a capable woman," he said. It was the safest and most honest thing he could say. Daniel nodded once, as though something had been settled. "That she is. Too capable, maybe. She takes on more than she should, and she does not complain about it, which means a man can forget to notice how much she is carrying." It was, Frederick thought, a somewhat remarkable thing for a father to say about his daughter's engagement, that the virtue of the arrangement was that it would remove a burden from her. It was not wrong, exactly. It was simply incomplete, and the incompleteness of it bothered him in a way he could not quite name. He got on with mending the fence and did not say any of this. The weeks settled into a rhythm. Frederick was good at his work in the way that men who have done a thing for a long time become good at it, not flashily, but thoroughly and reliably. Daniel gave him increasing responsibility as the summer drive preparations moved forward. He was the one who tracked the grazing patterns and managed the rotation of pastures. He was the one who negotiated with the other hands when disputes arose, which happened rarely because he had a way of addressing things before they became disputes. He was good at the work, and the work was good to him. And in the ordinary passages of days, he came to know Theresa Ralston in the way that people know each other when they live and work in close proximity, not through formal introductions or deliberate efforts, but through the accumulation of small moments and observations that eventually add up to something larger and more complete than any single conversation could produce. He knew that she drank her coffee with no sugar and always had a second cup. He knew that she was teaching James to do the account ledger, sitting with him at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings, and going through the columns with patient precision. He knew that she had an opinion about everything, but chose carefully which opinions to voice and which to keep, and that the ones she kept were often the most interesting ones, which he could tell by the occasional flash of something in her eyes when a conversation turned in a direction that was not the one she would have chosen. He knew that she loved her father with a fierceness that she wore like armor, and that she worried about him in a way she did not admit out loud. He also knew that Martin Colby came to the Double R twice a week, on Saturday evenings and on Wednesday afternoons, and that Theresa was always gracious and welcoming when he arrived, and that Colby always left after a few hours, and that the house seemed, after he left, slightly more itself again, like a room when a window has been opened. Frederick was not looking for evidence. He was not in the business of building a case. He was simply a man with working eyes who paid attention to the things around him, because paying attention was how you stayed alive on the frontier, and also, it turned out, how you fell in love. He realized with quiet certainty, somewhere around the 4th week of June, that he was in love with Theresa Ralston. He did not dress this realization up or add anything to it. He let it sit in him the way the truth of a thing sits in a person, plainly, taking up exactly as much space as it deserved, no more and no less. She was engaged to Martin Colby. He was a ranch hand on her father's property. He said nothing. He simply continued to do his work well and to be present in the ordinary ways that he was, and he waited, though he could not have said for what. July in Kansas was merciless that year. The heat pressed down on the territory like a hand, and the cattle drank twice what they normally drank, and the hands worked in the early hours of the morning and again in the late afternoon, and rested in the worst heat of midday, which was not a luxury but a necessity. Frederick spent those midday rest hours often on the shaded side of the barn with Calvin, who taught him a card game that neither of them could remember the rules to correctly, and which they therefore played with slightly different rules each time. They talked in the easy, unhurried way of men who have no urgent need to impress each other. It was during one of these midday pauses that Calvin said, without particular introduction, "Colby came by the store yesterday. I was in there buying bootlaces." Frederick was examining a loose rivet on his bridle. "That right. He was talking to Gerald Purcell. I was not trying to listen, but the store is not large." Calvin shuffled the cards. He was talking about the Ralston place, about the acreage, about what it might be worth if a man were to add it to an existing operation. Frederick looked up from the bridle. He said nothing. Calvin dealt the cards. "I am not saying anything, you understand. I am just mentioning it because I happen to hear it." "I understand," Frederick said. He thought about it for the rest of the afternoon, and he thought about it again while he was lying on his bunk that night. There was nothing he could do with that information. It was not his place to say anything to Daniel or to Theresa, and it was entirely possible that Colby simply had an investor's interest in the land that was wholly separate from any intention toward Theresa. Men of business thought about land constantly. It was not evidence of anything wrong, but it sat in him uneasily. He said nothing. The summer drive was scheduled for the 2nd week of August. Daniel had arranged to move 340 head to the rail yard at Caldwell, which would connect them to the national cattle market and provide the income that the ranch operated on for the better part of a year. Frederick and the other hands began the preparations in earnest in late July, checking and repairing equipment, sorting the cattle, checking the route for water sources, arranging the logistics of a drive that, while not long in terms of miles, still required careful management. It was during the preparations for the drive, on a Thursday afternoon in late July, that Frederick and Theresa had their first real conversation. She had come out to the corral to check on a mare that had thrown a shoe the day before, and Frederick was there working with Calvin to reshoe the horse. Theresa watched for a while, and when the work was done, she asked a question about the mare's gait, which showed she had been watching carefully and had noticed something specific and had formed an opinion about it before asking. They talked about the horse for a while, and then the conversation moved, as conversations do when they are between people who are genuinely interested in the same things, into the territory of the upcoming drive, and from there into a broader discussion about the cattle market and what the prices might be at the yards, and whether it was a good year or a difficult one. Theresa knew the numbers. She knew them better, Frederick suspected, than Daniel did, because she was the one who maintained the ledger. She spoke about the economics of the operation with a directness and precision that was brisk and unsentimental and, to Frederick, absolutely captivating. "What do you think a fair price per head is going to be?" he asked her. She told him. She cited figures from the past 3 years and the trend she had observed in the ledger. She mentioned that the Texas cattle market was more congested that year, and that Kansas beef was consequently commanding slightly better prices. She had thought about this carefully, and she spoke about it with the confidence of someone who trusts her own thinking. "You should come on the drive," Frederick said, meaning it as a compliment to her knowledge. She laughed at that, a real laugh, short and warm, the kind that happens when something genuinely surprises you. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it did something immediate and irreversible to him. "I think my father might have something to say about that," she said, and then, more quietly, "though I do not see why. I know this land as well as anyone." "Better than most," Frederick said. He meant it simply as a fact, and she took it the way it was meant, with a small nod that was neither modest nor immodest but simply accepting. They stood for a moment in the afternoon light, which was long and golden at that hour, and which was settling over the pasture behind the house with a kind of generous beauty. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the grass. The smell of hay and warm earth and the faint green smell of the creek that ran along the southern edge of the property was all around them. "You are from Missouri, Mr. Slater?" she asked. "Grew up there," he said. "Left when I was about 17. What made you leave?" "Circumstances," he said, and she accepted that without pressing, because she was a person who understood that some answers were the whole of what a person was able to give. She gathered the lead rope she had come out with to check the mare and turned toward the house. "Thank you for looking after her," she said. "She will be fine," Frederick said. "She has good feet overall." Theresa glanced back at him over her shoulder once before she went inside, and he stood with his hand on the corral fence and watched the door close behind her, and the meadowlark was still singing in the grass. The drive went well. It took 4 days to move the cattle to the rail yard, which involved 2 nights camped on the trail, and Frederick managed the logistics of it with the quiet competence that had by now made him, whatever his official title, the de facto foreman of the outfit. The cattle went through the chutes without serious incident. The prices Theresa had predicted in her ledger came in almost exactly right. It was a solid year, not spectacular but solid, and when Frederick rode back onto the Double R property with Daniel in the long August evening and gave him the final accounting, he saw the relief in the older man's face. "Good work," Daniel said. "You have earned your wages and more." He offered Frederick a permanent position on the ranch year-round, with a small increase in pay and the use of a slightly better quarter that would be cleaned out and made proper. Frederick accepted. He was not sure exactly why he was accepting. The work was good, he told himself. The ranch was good. The territory was good. He let himself stop there. August became September, which in Kansas meant a slight easing of the killing heat and the first hints of color in the cottonwood trees along the creek. The cattle settled into their fall routine. The work became quieter and steadier. James started back to school and Rodrigo went home to his family in New Mexico because the seasonal work was done, and Calvin stayed on for the fall work, which meant the crew was Frederick, Henry, and Calvin, which was the right number of people for what was required. Martin Colby came twice a week as he always had, and the October wedding date was discussed in the way that approaching events are discussed, with a kind of social inevitability, as though it had already happened and was simply waiting for the calendar to catch up with it. Frederick noticed things he perhaps should not have noticed. He noticed that when Colby arrived, Theresa was always composed and pleasant, but that the warmth that was ordinarily natural to her manner was replaced, in those hours, by something more deliberate, as though she were wearing her friendliness rather than expressing it. He noticed that she never laughed around Colby the way she had laughed that afternoon in the corral, the short, genuine laugh that surprised itself out of her. He noticed that Colby gave orders to the hands on the property as though they already worked for him, which they did not, and that he did it in a way that had a proprietary undertone that Frederick found unpleasant. He also noticed that Daniel, when Colby was present, was deferential in a way he was not with other people, that the old man's confidence and easy authority went slightly soft around the edges in Colby's presence, the way a man goes soft when he is dealing with someone he has decided he needs. Frederick said nothing about any of this to anyone. He did his work. He was courteous to Colby when their paths crossed, which was not difficult because Frederick had no personal grievance with the man. There was nothing specific to point to, nothing that constituted evidence of wrongness. There was only a feeling, which was not the basis for action. The event that changed the shape of everything happened on a Wednesday in late September. Frederick had gone into town in the morning to collect a supply order from the dry goods store, flour and salt, and several items for the smokehouse work that was coming up. He was loading the wagon outside the store when Martin Colby came out of the land office across the street, and with him was a man Frederick had not seen before, a lawyer type, by the look of him, with a city coat and a leather case under his arm. They were talking closely, and Frederick was not trying to hear them, but the street was quiet in the late morning and sound carried. What he heard was this, Colby said. Once the title transfers, the southern pasture connects the two properties and the water rights become unified. That is the piece that makes the whole thing viable. The lawyer said something too quiet to catch. Colby said, the marriage solves the inheritance question. It is the simplest arrangement. They went in different directions, and Frederick stood with his hand on a flour sack and felt the weight of what he had just heard settle onto him like something cold and heavy. It was not proof of anything he could lay before a judge. It was not even proof in the conventional sense. But it was a kind of clarity, the kind that arrives after a long period of half knowing something and refusing to fully arrive at the knowledge. He drove back to the ranch and said nothing. He spent 2 days with the knowledge inside him, testing it from different angles, asking himself whether he was interpreting it correctly or whether he was hearing what he wanted to hear, because he was a man in love with an engaged woman, and that was a fact that made a man susceptible to a certain kind of wishful hearing. He tested it honestly, and he still arrived at the same place. He also spent those 2 days asking himself what his role in this was. He was a ranch hand. He was not this woman's family. He was not her confidant. He was not her suitor. He had no claim on her and no standing to speak to her private affairs, and getting involved in another man's engagement, even with the best of intentions, was the kind of thing that could end with a man having to leave a job he valued, and a territory that had begun to feel like something closer to home than anywhere he had been in a long time. He decided he would say nothing unless there came a moment where saying nothing was worse than speaking. That moment arrived on the first Friday of October. Frederick was coming back from the eastern pasture in the late afternoon when he passed close to the south side of the house, where the laundry line was, and where Theresa was standing with a basket at her feet and her hands empty at her sides, looking out at the flat distance with an expression that stopped Frederick's horse. She was not crying. She was not distressed in any obvious way. But the expression on her face was the face of a person carrying something very heavy and not knowing how to set it down, and it was the most naked and unguarded thing he had seen on her face in the weeks he had known her, and he could not ride past it. He dismounted and walked his horse the rest of the way to the line and said quietly, "Are you all right?" She turned to look at him with those amber fire eyes, and for a moment he thought she was going to say yes, she was fine, thank you, in the way that people say they are fine when they are not. But she did not. She said, "He wants to move up the date, Martin. He wants the wedding in November. He says there is a business matter that makes the timing important." Frederick said nothing for a moment. Then he said, carefully, "What do you want?" She looked at him as though the question surprised her, as though someone asking what she wanted was unusual enough to require a moment of adjustment. "My father has agreed to it," she said, which was not an answer. "I know. What do you want?" The prairie wind moved through the dry grass and the late sun stretched out long and low across the pasture, and somewhere behind the barn a horse was moving in its stall. "I want it," she said finally, and the honesty of that answer went through Frederick like a current. "I have told myself all the right things about it. He is stable. He is reliable. He will provide well. My father is not getting younger, and this ranch has had difficult years, and this arrangement it is sensible." She stopped. Then very quietly, "I want it." Frederick considered his words the way a man considers the footing before crossing uncertain ground. "Is it possible," he said, "that something might be driving the timing that is not entirely about you?" She looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I am not sure I ought to say more than that," he said. "I do not have knowledge, only an impression, and it is not my place." "Tell me," she said. He did. He told her what he had heard on the street in town, keeping to exactly what he had heard, and not adding interpretation beyond what was necessary to convey the significance of it. He watched her face as he spoke, watched the composure hold and then shift and then hold again in a different way, tighter and more deliberate. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "The southern pasture," she said at last. "My father deeded that to me when I turned 21. He wanted me to have something of my own. It is in my name." A pause. "It is the only part of the Double R that is not in my father's name." Frederick said nothing. "The water rights on that parcel run all the way to Colby's northern fence line," she said. "If that land transferred, it would unite the water access across both properties." She was working it through as she spoke, and she was doing it with the same precise, ledger-keeping intelligence she brought to everything. "That is worth considerably more than the land itself." "I know," Frederick said. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment in the late afternoon light, and what he saw in her eyes was not the warmth he had come to know as her ordinary expression, but something harder and clearer and more alive. The face of a woman who had just understood something and was deciding what to do about it. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I may be wrong," Frederick said. "You are not wrong," she said simply, and went inside with her basket. He stood at the laundry line for a moment longer and then led Drum back to the barn, and he sat with what he had done and turned it over in his mind. He had involved himself. He had taken a side without being asked to take a side. Whatever happened next, whatever Theresa did or did not do with the information he had given her, he had stepped out of the careful neutrality that a ranch hand was supposed to maintain, and there would be consequences of one kind or another. He could not regret it. The following Tuesday, Martin Colby arrived at the Double R in the late afternoon in his good wagon with his matched gray horses, and he was shown into the parlor by Daniel, who had clearly been forewarned by his daughter that there was something to discuss. Frederick was working near enough to the house to know, without being able to hear, that the discussion was substantial. He could see the light in the parlor window from the corral where he was repairing a gate, and it stayed lit for a long time. Henry came over at one point and noted that there seemed to be some business happening up at the house. Frederick said, "Seems like." Henry went back to what he was doing, which was the advisable approach. Colby left an hour later, and from the way he drove his matched grays down the road, it was apparent that things had not gone the way he had expected. The next morning, Theresa told her father what she had told Colby, and Daniel, who was a man of principle in his core, even if his judgment had been clouded by financial anxiety and the desire to see his daughter settled, listened to the whole of it, and then sat in silence for a considerable period of time. Frederick found out the shape of this from James, who was not a gossip but who was a 17-year-old boy who found the proceedings dramatic and could not entirely contain his commentary. He told Frederick, with a mixture of excitement and solemnity that was charming in its adolescent transparency, that his sister had called off the engagement. "What did your father say?" Frederick asked. "He said he needed to think," James said. "And then he walked out to the south pasture and stood there for a while. And then he came back and said that Theresa had made the right decision." Frederick nodded. "She has good judgment," he said. "She always has," James said, with the matter-of-fact loyalty of a younger sibling who has been looking up to someone for their whole life. The next weeks were not simple. Martin Colby did not disappear from the landscape. He was a prominent man in Caldwell, after all, and could not simply be wished away. He made no open trouble, because he was not that kind of man, but his manner toward the Ralston family cooled noticeably. And there were those in town who took his side in the matter, which is the way of things in small communities where a man of means carries social weight. Theresa bore the social friction of it with the same quiet steadiness that she brought to everything, though Frederick could see, in the occasional tightening around her eyes, that it cost her something. The ranch had an awkward period in November when one of Daniel's business arrangements with a supplier arrangements that Colby had been quietly facilitating fell through, apparently as a consequence of the broken engagement. This created a real financial difficulty for the winter supply situation, and Frederick saw Daniel age slightly during those weeks, the worry sitting heavily on a man who had carried a lot of weight over a long life. Frederick quietly solved two parts of the problem without drawing attention to having done so. He had been in the territory long enough to have relationships with other suppliers, and he called in a minor social debt from a merchant in Wichita who owed him a good turn from a cattle deal the previous year. He also did the calculations on the winter supply requirements and found places where careful substitution would reduce the shortfall without reducing the actual needs of the ranch. He told Daniel about the arrangements plainly, without presenting them as his own cleverness, just as practical solutions he had found to a practical problem. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to give you the foreman title formally starting next month, the pay that goes with it." "I appreciate that," Frederick said. "I want to ask you something," Daniel said. Frederick waited. "My daughter," Daniel said. "I am not a blind man, Frederick. I have not been one for some time." He said it without accusation or particular warmth. He said it like a man stating a fact that had been apparent to him and that he had decided to address directly. Frederick met his gaze and held it. "I have not said anything to her that was not appropriate," he said. "I have not acted on anything." "I know that," Daniel said. "I am not raising it as a complaint." He paused. "She is her own woman. She has been her own woman since she was about 14 years old, and I cannot pretend otherwise. I'm not going to tell you to stay away from her because I do not have the right to do that and because I think it would not change what is already in motion." He looked out toward the pasture for a moment. "I am simply telling you that I am not blind." "I understand," Frederick said. "She deserves something real," Daniel said. "Whatever that means to her, she deserves it." Frederick thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about it while he was doing his evening rounds of the corral, and again while he was eating his supper, and again while he lay on his bunk with the prairie wind moving against the walls of the bunkhouse and the single lamp he kept burning for an hour each night casting its steady small light on the ceiling above him. He had waited, more or less. He had been there, quietly and without agenda, while Theresa's engagement had been what it was, and then had been what it turned out to be, and then had come apart. He had not pushed, he had not maneuvered, he had simply remained steady and present and honest, and he was still there. He was not sure that was enough. He was not sure it was the right kind of declaration, but it was what he had, and it was genuine. The December cold came in with authority, the way it always did on the Kansas plains, arriving not gradually, but as a fact one morning when you woke and the world was hard and white. The cattle required more management in the cold, and the work shifted its character accordingly: more time in the barn, more careful attention to the water troughs, more awareness of the horse's needs. Frederick liked winter work. There was a clarity to it. It was on the 14th of December, a Saturday, that the conversation happened. Theresa had come out to the barn to bring a plate of food to Frederick and Henry, who had been working late on a fence repair that could not wait. Henry had taken his plate and gone back to the bunkhouse, and Frederick was still in the barn with his, sitting on a hay bale near the wood stove that kept the barn minimally warm, when Theresa came back in from having checked on the bay mare that had been her concern all autumn. She sat down on the hay bale across from him without particular ceremony, which was characteristic of her. She looked at him with those amber fire eyes in the warm light of the stove, and she said, "I want to thank you for the fence work," he said. "Do not be modest," she said, and there was something in her voice that was warm and slightly teasing and also entirely serious at the same time. "You know what for telling me what you heard, for not deciding that it was not your place." She paused. "And before that, for the way you have been, for being here and for being, she searched for the word, reliable. That is the word that keeps coming to me. You are reliable in a way that is not just about the cattle. Frederick set his plate down on the hay bale beside him. I should tell you, he said, that I am not being reliable as a general character virtue in this particular context. I should be honest with you about that. She looked at him. The barn was very quiet. The stove ticked with heat. I know, she said quietly. You do, he said. I am not unobservant, she said with a small, careful half-smile. No, he said, you are the most observant person I have met in some time. He looked at her directly because Frederick Slater did not know how to be indirect and did not intend to learn. I did not say anything because it was not the right time to say anything. And I was not certain it was my place even now. I am still not fully certain. But I care for you very much, Theresa, very much. That is the plain truth of it, and I want you to know it, and I understand that you may not. Frederick, she said. He stopped. I know, she said again. I have known for some time. She was quiet for a moment. I told myself it was not the right thing. I told myself I was engaged and that certain feelings were not appropriate to entertain, and I was very firm with myself about it. She looked at the stove. I was not very convincing. The silence between them was the kind of silence that is full rather than empty. What I want to tell you, she said, looking back at him, is that I am not going to make another decision about my life because it is the sensible arrangement or because it provides something practical. I have done that, and it was not, she stopped. It was not enough. It was a cage that was comfortable on the outside, and that was all it was. She took a breath. If I am to do this, I am going to do it for the right reasons and in the right way, and I am not going to be hurried about it. I would not hurry you for anything in the world, Frederick said. I know that too, she said. And this time the smile was whole and real, and it went all the way into those amber eyes and stayed there. That is partly the point. He reached across the space between the hay bales and held out his hand, palm up, and she looked at it for a moment and then put her hand in his. And they sat like that in the warm and quiet barn while the December wind moved outside and the horses shifted softly in their stalls. It was not a dramatic beginning. It was not a beginning at all in the formal sense. They did not announce it or declare it or mark it with any ceremony. But from that evening forward, something between them that had been taut and unresolved eased into a different shape, and that shape was warmer and steadier, and more itself than anything that had come before it. The winter passed with the particular texture of cold weather ranch life. The long dark evenings, the necessity of proximity for warmth, the way that winter made the inside of a house a different kind of country than the outside. Frederick spent more time near the house than he strictly needed to, and this was noticed by no one in particular and commented upon by no one at all, which was the way of things on a working ranch where the people involved were practical and the proprieties were observed without being performed. He and Theresa talked. They talked in the way that people who are discovering each other talk, at first carefully, and then with increasing latitude, and then finally with the kind of open-handed frankness that is the mark of a real conversation between people who trust each other. She told him about her mother, about what it had been like to lose her, and to become, at 21, the functional center of the household. She told him about the years of holding everything together, and about how it had made her capable and also, in some ways, lonely, because the people who are relied upon are often not the people who are worried about. He listened to all of this with his full attention, which was the most valuable thing he could offer, and she knew it. He told her about Missouri and about his father's death and the debts and the years of itinerant ranch work. He told her about the things he had seen and the places he had been and about the particular shape of a life that had been spent moving through the country without anchor. He told her that Caldwell was the first place in a long time that had felt like it might become a permanent address, and he told her why. And she received this with the composure of a woman who was moved and chose not to show the full extent of it, which he understood and respected. There was also joy between them, which is sometimes the thing that gets lost in the telling of a love story. The plain, uncomplicated joy of two people who like each other, who find each other funny, who discover that the same things amuse them and the same things matter to them, and that the hours pass with a different quality when the other person is present. Frederick, who was not by nature a man of much laughter, laughed more in that winter than he had in several preceding years. Theresa, who laughed at exactly the moments no one expected, found that he anticipated those moments and sometimes met her there before she arrived. James watched all of this with the interested attention of a 17-year-old who was thoroughly entertained by his sister's situation and who, to his great credit, said nothing except occasionally to Frederick, who he had developed a genuine fondness for. "You like her," James said once, with the directness of a person who had not yet learned the adult habit of talking around things. "I do," Frederick said. James considered this with great seriousness. "Good," he said. "Martin Colby never looked at her the way you do." Frederick did not ask how he looked at her. He thought he probably knew. Spring came back to the territory, which on the Kansas plains was a dramatic and almost violent event. The grass coming green almost overnight after the long brown months, the sky returning to its enormous blue, the meadowlarks back in the pasture singing with what seemed, on mornings when everything had been cold for so long, like genuine exuberance. The cattle moved back to the open pastures. The days stretched. The work changed its shape again to the spring work, which was fencing and breeding management, and the slow accumulation of condition that would make the summer drive possible. Frederick and Theresa had been moving toward each other for 5 months in the deliberate, careful way they had agreed upon, and as the spring advanced and the world opened up around them, something in the pacing of it changed. It was not that they had been holding back exactly. It was more that certain things had needed the time they had taken, and they had taken it, and now the time was right for something more. He asked her to walk with him on the first warm Sunday evening of April, which was not a formal request, but was understood by both of them to be somewhat formal in its way. They walked along the creek that ran south of the property, where the cottonwood trees were leafing out in a pale and tender green that caught the last light of the evening and held it. The water in the creek was running high with snowmelt from the north, and it made a sound that was cool and continuous and pleasant. He had been turning over in his mind for several weeks exactly what he wanted to say and how to say it, and he had in the end decided that the most honest approach was also the most direct one, because Theresa was a person who valued honesty more than ornamentation. He stopped walking at a point where the creek made a small curve, and the cottonwood trees stood close on both sides, and the evening light came through the leaves in a moving, dappled way that was genuinely beautiful. He turned to face her. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I have been thinking about how to say this, and I could not find a better way than the plain version of it." She looked at him with those eyes that he had spent a year learning to read, and in them he could see that she was not surprised and was not performing unsurprise and was simply present, fully and clearly. "I do not have a great deal to offer you in the material sense," he said. "I have my wages and my horse and the skills I have accumulated, and I have more years of hard work ahead of me, which I intend to spend building something worth having. I cannot promise you a particular outcome. I can promise you that I will be faithful and present, and that I will work as hard as any man has ever worked. And I can promise that I will see you clearly, all the time, without deciding in advance what I want to see. That is what I have." Theresa Ralston looked at Frederick Slater in the evening light beside the spring-running creek, and she thought about the year behind them, about the patience of it and the steadiness of it, about the man who had been told she was spoken for and had stayed anyway, who had been present and quiet and honest, who had told her what she needed to know when she needed to know it, who had laughed with her and worried with her and worked beside her and never once tried to own her or arrange her or make her fit a shape she had not chosen. "Yes," she said. It was the simplest possible answer, and it was entirely sufficient. He reached for her hand and she gave it to him, and then she stepped close and he put his arms around her, and she put her head against his chest where the solid, steady warmth of him was, and the cottonwood trees moved over them in the spring wind and the creek ran on beside them, and the meadowlark was somewhere in the grass, still singing. They told Daniel that evening after supper. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, and he looked up when they came in together, and something in his face settled, not with surprise, because he had not been blind, but with a kind of deep relief, the way a man looks when something he had hoped for but did not feel he could count on turns out to be true. He stood up and shook Frederick's hand, and then he put his arms around Theresa and held her for a moment. And when he stepped back, there was something bright in the old man's eyes that he composed back into his usual dignity with practiced efficiency. "About time," James said loudly from the next room, and the three of them looked at the doorway where he was very poorly pretending not to have been listening, and then they all laughed, and the laughter filled the kitchen the way good laughter fills a room entirely and without reserve. They were married in June of 1883. The ceremony was held on the Double R property because the spring of that year had been beautiful and the land was at its best in June, and because Theresa had no desire for a large church event. What she wanted was something genuine, in a place that meant something, with people who were real. It was a small wedding. Daniel stood up with Theresa and gave her hand to Frederick with an expression of formal solemnity that wavered once when Theresa looked at him, and caught him looking back at her with absolute transparent pride. James stood beside Frederick because Frederick had asked him to, which mattered to James more than he was able to express, and which he expressed, therefore, by standing very straight and taking the responsibility with great seriousness. Calvin was there, and Henry, and a small group of Theresa's friends from town who had stood by her through the winter of social awkwardness that had followed the broken engagement. Gerald Purcell was there with his wife, who cried at weddings as a matter of principle. The minister was a traveling Methodist man who had a circuit through the territory, and who was a practical and plain-spoken man, well suited to marrying a practical and plain-spoken couple. The vows were the traditional ones, said with the full weight of two people who had come to them carefully and without illusion, and when they were exchanged, there was nothing in the faces of either of them that was anything other than completely meant. When it was done and they returned to face the small gathered group as husband and wife, Theresa put her mouth close to Frederick's ear and said, very quietly so only he could hear, "I am very glad you stayed." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were the color of old gold in the June afternoon, and everything he had been carrying for the past year was in them, clearly and without concealment, and it was evident to everyone who looked at him. "There was nowhere else I wanted to be," he said. The summer of their first year of marriage was the summer that Frederick truly became part of the Double R in the complete sense, not just as a hired foreman, but as someone for whom the land was a personal concern and a personal investment. He had been careful during the courtship period not to overstep his position. The ranch was Daniel's and would eventually be Theresa's and James's, and it was not his place to manage it as though it were already his. But now, with the formal structure of the marriage in place, and Daniel's explicit welcome of him as a son-in-law and a partner in the operation, he was able to bring the full force of his knowledge and his judgment to bear. He had ideas about the Double R that he had been holding carefully. He had been observing the operation for a year, and he had seen where the efficiencies were possible and where the existing approaches were working against themselves. He presented these ideas to Daniel with the same directness he brought to everything, not as criticism of what had come before, but as possibilities for what could come next. Daniel listened and asked questions and pushed back on 2 points and accepted the rest, and the collaborative nature of the conversation was satisfying in a way that Frederick had not fully anticipated. By the fall of that year, the Double R was running more efficiently and the improvements were visible in the ledger. The winter supply issue did not recur. The summer drive had been the best in several years. Theresa looked at the numbers in the ledger and then looked at Frederick across the kitchen table and said, "You see what you worked out here," and held the open ledger toward him. "We worked it out," he said. "There you go being modest again," she said. "I am not being modest. The accounts are your work as much as any part of it." She closed the ledger. "Then I suppose we are both very capable," she said, and the look she gave him was warm and private and entirely his. The first year of their marriage was full in every sense. They were learning each other in the complete way that married people learn each other, which includes the difficulties as well as the beauties, and they both brought to the difficulties the same honesty they had brought to the courtship, speaking plainly, not letting things go unaddressed, trusting that the foundation was solid enough to bear the weight of real conversation. There were disagreements, because two strong-minded people will disagree, and they were navigated with more grace than either of them might have managed with a different partner, because they both had learned in different ways the cost of swallowing what needed to be said. One of those disagreements was about the land. Specifically, it was about the southern pasture that was in Theresa's name, the land that had been at the center of the whole Colby situation. Theresa wanted to formally consolidate the title of that parcel with the rest of the ranch property, bringing it under the double-R deed rather than holding it separately. Frederick thought the separate holding was worth keeping for reasons of both practical and legal protection. They argued about it pleasantly for 2 evenings, and then went to see a lawyer in Wichita who specialized in land titles. And the lawyer supported Frederick's position with such a thorough explanation that Theresa revised her view, which she did without complaint, and without making it into anything other than what it was, a practical decision made on better information. "You were right," she said on the drive back from Wichita. "You asked the right questions," he said. "It was your question that got the explanation." She regarded him from the wagon seat where they were sitting side by side with the broad September prairie rolling out ahead of them. "You are very committed to making sure I get credit." "You deserve it," he said simply. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder and then straightened up, because they were on the open road and there was dignity to consider. But she took his hand and kept it, which was sufficient. In the spring of 1884, Theresa told Frederick she was expecting their first child. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, in the same direct way she told him most things, and he set down his coffee cup and looked at her and then stood up and came around the table and held her face in both his hands and pressed his forehead to hers, and they stayed like that for a long moment without speaking. "Are you happy?" she asked him. "I am not able to tell you how happy I am," he said. "I do not have enough language for it." She laughed at that, the short, warm, surprised laugh that was still, to him, one of the best sounds in the world. "You always have enough language," she said. "Not for this," he said, and she could see that he meant it. Daniel, when he heard, went out to the south pasture and stood there for a while, which was what he did with large feelings, and came back looking slightly younger than he had in some time. James, who was nearly 19 now and had the combination of earnestness and humor that was characteristic of him, said, "I am going to be the best uncle this territory has ever produced." "You can start by helping with the garden," Theresa told him. "I was thinking of a more impressive contribution," James said, "but I can start with the garden." The child was born in November of 1884 in the ranch house with the help of a midwife from Caldwell named Mrs. Dolores Avery, who had presided over the arrivals of half the children in the county, and who ran the proceedings with the focused authority of a general. The birth was not easy. The hours were long, and Frederick, who had managed cattle drives and horse injuries, and a dozen varieties of frontier difficulty without visible alarm, spent most of those hours in the kitchen in a state of contained but evident anxiety that Daniel and James found both impressive and somewhat amusing. When Mrs. Avery came to the kitchen door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Slater." "Mother and child are well." Frederick put both hands flat on the kitchen table and breathed in and out once very slowly, which was the most demonstrative thing anyone who knew him had ever seen him do. The boy was healthy and loud about it. He had, as newborns do, a face that was not yet entirely itself, but in the dark hair and in something about the set of the eyes, Theresa already saw something she recognized, and in the small, fierce clench of the tiny fists, she saw something she recognized from another direction entirely. They named him Daniel James Slater, for his grandfather and his uncle, which made Daniel go out to the south pasture again, and made James walk around with a self-satisfied expression for approximately 3 weeks. Daniel Slater, who was called Danny in the ordinary run of days, grew into himself through the winters and springs of the late 1880s in the way that children on working ranches grow, embedded in the reality of the place, learning it from the ground up. He was riding by the time he was 4, which concerned Theresa briefly and did not concern Frederick at all, because the horse chosen for this purpose was a small, elderly, unflappable mare named Biscuit, who had the temperament of a person who had decided that nothing in the world was worth getting worked up about. A second child arrived in the spring of 1887, a girl, this time, born with the same dark hair as her mother but with her father's green eyes, which was a combination that produced a face of such immediate and complete beauty that even Mrs. Avery, who was not given to sentimentality, remarked upon it. They named her Margaret, for Theresa's mother, and Daniel the grandfather Daniel, who had by this point become a little slower in his movement but no less sharp in his mind, held her on the evening of her birth, and was entirely undone by it in a way that made everyone in the room find important things to look at in various other directions. Those years were full in the way that the best years of a life are full, not without difficulty, but with a quality of texture and meaning that made even the difficult parts worth having. There were hard winters and there were losses. A cold snap in January of 1886 killed nearly 40 head of cattle, which was a significant financial blow, and there were the ordinary griefs of a life lived on the frontier, the neighbors who did not make it, the seasons that turned against you. But the Double R endured, and the family that lived on it endured and even strengthened. James married in 1888, at the age of 22, a young woman named Clara from a family in Wichita who had come to Caldwell to visit relations. She was clever and energetic, and she adored James, and the feeling was very clearly mutual, and she adapted to ranch life with a practicality and good humor that won Theresa's complete approval within approximately 2 months. Daniel Sr., whose health had been declining gradually since about 1886, died peacefully in the winter of 1889, in his own bedroom in the house he had built and the land he had worked for 2 decades. He went quietly, in the way that some people go, with his family around him and the ranch outside the window and his life as complete and accounted for as any life can be. Frederick sat with him in the last hours, and in one of those hours Daniel had looked at him with clear eyes and said, in the slightly labored voice of a man whose strength was going, "You are good for her, you always were." "She is good for me," Frederick said. "That is the more significant part of it." Daniel had smiled at that. "She is that," he said. They buried him on the Double R property, on a rise above the south pasture, which was where he had stood so many times with his large feelings. The marker was plain stone with his name and the dates and nothing else, because he had been a plain man, and because anything elaborate would have been wrong. In the spring of 1890, Frederick and Theresa were 36 and 33, respectively, and the Double R was, under their joint management, the strongest operation it had ever been. The herd had grown to nearly 600 head. The land had been improved with better water management, including a small system of irrigation ditches that Frederick had studied and implemented over 2 seasons. There was a new barn, properly built, and the house had been extended to accommodate the family, which was a project that Theresa had managed with her usual fierce competence, and that had produced 2 additional bedrooms and a proper kitchen that was the envy, as Clara put it, of half the county. One evening that spring, after the children were in bed, Danny was 5 and Margaret was 3. Theresa and Frederick sat on the porch of the house in the late evening light. The smell of the prairie was all around them, that particular combination of grass and earth and distant water and wide sky that is unique to the Kansas plains, and that, once it has been part of a person's life for long enough, becomes something close to the smell of home itself. The cattle were visible in the south pasture, moving in the golden last light, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were full green, and the sky was the deep layered blue of a clear late spring evening going toward dark. Frederick had his arm around Theresa's shoulders, which was where his arm had come to rest in the natural course of evenings spent this way over 7 years of marriage, and she was leaning against him in the comfortable way of people who have found the right arrangement and have no inclination to change it. "Do you remember," she said, "the first real conversation we had, by the corral about the mare?" "I remember," he said. "I thought then," she said, with the reflective tone of someone returning to a memory they have turned over many times, "that you were the most direct person I had spoken to in a long time. You said exactly what you meant and no more and no less." "I have not improved in that regard," he said. She laughed softly. "I have not asked you to." She was quiet for a moment. "I was so certain I was going to do what was expected of me. I had it all arranged in my mind, the shape of the life I was going to have, and it was a perfectly reasonable life from a certain angle." "I know," he said. "I would have been unhappy," she said, plainly and without drama. "Not dramatically unhappy, just not alive in the way I wanted to be alive." He tightened his arm slightly around her shoulders. "And then you stayed," she said. "You were just there, working and being honest and being yourself and not asking for anything, not pushing anything." And it changed the calculation completely, because suddenly there was a version of things that was not just reasonable but was, she paused, and he could feel her thinking, reaching for the right word, real. "It was all I knew how to be," he said. "I know," she said. "That is the whole point of it." They sat in the evening that was moving toward dark, and the first stars were beginning to come into the deep blue overhead, and the cattle were settling in the pasture, and from inside the house there was the faint sound of one of the children calling out something indistinct in their sleep, and then settling again. It was an ordinary evening on a working ranch in Kansas in 1890. There was nothing remarkable about it in any way that would have been legible to a stranger, but in the accumulated weight of everything that had brought them here, the year of careful distance, the broken engagement, the conversation in the barn in December, the wedding in June, the children and the seasons and the losses and the building and the plain, daily, unglamorous, essential work of making a life together that was genuinely and completely theirs. It was as full as an evening could possibly be. The third child arrived in the late summer of 1891. Another boy, born with considerable enthusiasm, and named William after Frederick's father in the spirit of honoring what had come before and making peace with it. He was a large and cheerful baby, and he grew into a large and cheerful small person, who adored his older brother with the complete and uncritical devotion that younger children sometimes bring to their elders, and who chased his sister Margaret around the yard with a focused determination that she found alternately amusing and exhausting. Danny grew through those years into a boy who was plainly going to become the same kind of man his father was, quiet, steady, observant, with a capacity for hard work, and a kind of unhurried intelligence that processed things slowly and arrived at good conclusions. He was the one who, at age 7, figured out on his own that one of the mares in the East Corral was favoring her left front leg in a way that was different from the right side favoring she did normally, and reported this to Frederick with the gravity of a man raising a serious issue. Frederick examined the leg and found an early-stage injury that, caught when it was, healed cleanly, and he looked at his son afterward with an expression that Danny did not have enough experience to fully read, but that was something very close to pride. Theresa saw him look at Danny that way, and she looked at Frederick with an expression of her own that he had learned to read completely over the years. It was the expression of a person who is holding a very large feeling and choosing to hold it rather than release it, and there was a warmth in it that was entirely directed at him. In the early years of the 1890s, the broader world was changing around the territory. The frontier, as it had been understood, was formally closing. The great western expansion that had defined the preceding decades was resolving itself into the settled geography of a country becoming more ordered, more administered, more connected by rail and telegraph to the rest of itself. The wild quality of the West, the openness and the lawlessness and the extraordinary freedom and the extraordinary danger of it, was not disappearing, but it was transforming, and men who had lived in it were finding that they were increasingly men of a particular historical moment, and that the moment was passing. Frederick thought about this sometimes, about what it meant to have been the kind of man he had been, moving through the territory with no anchor, belonging to no particular place or person. He thought about the years before Caldwell, the drives and the camps and the constant motion, and he thought about whether he missed it, and the answer he arrived at was honest and clear. He did not miss it. He had needed it for the years it was what his life was, and he was grateful for what it had made of him. But the life he had now was not a lesser life but a greater one, built from the same materials, the steadiness, the endurance, the practical competence, but directed towards something that had weight and permanence and meaning that the motion had not provided. He had told Theresa this once in one of their evening conversations, and she had said, "I think you always knew that was what you were working toward. You just needed to find where it was." "I needed to find you," he had said, which was more direct than he usually was, and which had made her look at him with an expression he had treasured for a long time afterward. The Double R, by the mid-1890s, was an established and respected operation. Frederick and Theresa had built it carefully and honestly over more than a decade of genuine effort, and the results were visible not just in the ledger and the herd numbers but in the quality of the land itself, which was managed with a care for its long-term health that was not universal among the cattle operations of the territory. The water was good. The grass was managed in rotation. The cattle were healthy and the horses were better than most. James and Clara had 2 children of their own by this point, and had built a house on a section of the property to the northeast of the main ranch house, which made the Double R, in its extended sense, a family compound of the kind that was not uncommon in the West when families put down roots and stayed. Clara and Theresa had developed the warm and frank friendship of women who respect each other's intelligence and who share a terrain, literal and otherwise. One evening in the early autumn of 1895, Frederick and Theresa sat on the porch again, as they did habitually in the good weather evenings. Danny was 11 and Margaret was 8, and William was 4, and the 3 of them were visible in the fading evening light at the edge of the yard, Danny showing Margaret something in the grass, probably an insect, because he had recently developed an interest in the natural world that was systematic and serious in a way that reminded Frederick of Theresa's approach to the ledger, and William following them both with the devoted persistence that was his characteristic mode. "I want to tell you something," Theresa said. Frederick turned to look at her. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what my life would have been if things had gone differently, not in a sad way, in an accounting way, like going through the ledger and finding where the good figures are." "And," he said. She looked at him with those eyes that were, after 13 years of marriage, still capable of stopping his thoughts entirely. "Every good figure in the ledger has you in it," she said. "Not because you provided for things, though you have, but because having you beside me made the things worth counting. The children and the land and the work and the life of it. I want you to know that I see that clearly, and I have seen it for some time, and I do not say it often enough." Frederick Slater, who had ridden into Caldwell in the spring of 1882 looking for work and a dry place to sleep, looked at his wife in the autumn evening light, and felt the truth of his own life settle over him with a warmth and completeness that was beyond anything he would have predicted for himself in those early riding-in days, beyond anything he would have dared to predict. "I was told you were spoken for," he said quietly, because they both knew the whole shape of the story. "You stayed anyway," she said. "I did." Why, she asked, though she knew. She always asked this occasionally, not because she did not know the answer, but because she liked hearing him say it. "Because you were worth staying for," he said. "Because whatever else was true about the situation, that was true, and it was enough to stay on." She took his hand in the way she had taken it in the barn in December of 1882, when the stove was ticking, and the horses were shifting softly in their stalls, and the prairie wind was at the walls. She held it with the same warm and complete intention she had brought to everything she had ever done, and he held hers back with the steadiness that was the fundamental quality of him. The evening moved on around them. The children came in when called, William needing to be called twice, and the second time louder. Supper was warm on the stove, and the house was full of the sounds and smells of a household that was alive and inhabited and deeply, undeniably itself. James and Clara came over after supper as they sometimes did, and there was coffee and conversation, and the pleasant noise of the extended family gathered in the kitchen where the lamp was burning. Later, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and the last lamp was turned down, Theresa and Frederick stood for a moment at the window of their room that looked south, toward the pasture and the rise where Daniel was buried and the cottonwood trees along the creek and the flat open distance of the prairie that went on, and on toward the dark horizon under a sky that was thick with stars. "Good night, Frederick," she said. "Good night, Theresa," he said. He said her name the way he always said it, with the full weight of all the accumulated knowing behind it, all the years and all the seasons and all the conversations, and all the ordinary days and extraordinary ones. With the full weight of a man who had found the thing he had not known he was looking for, and had, for the rest of his life, been standing in it and grateful. The lamp went out and the prairie stars burned on overhead and the cattle settled in the south pasture, and the creek moved in its course and the double R sat in the dark Kansas night, quietly itself, anchored in the land and in the life that had been made on it with patience and honesty, and the particular courage of people who choose to love each other clearly and for the right reasons. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every sense that mattered, everything.